Bună ziua. Well, today's novelist is an American, and I don't think he has quite the coverage or the fame that he deserves for his novels. The novel I'd like to talk about is The Château by William Maxwell, and here it is. And it was written in 1961. It relates the story of an American couple after the Second World War called Harold and Barbara Rhodes, who travelled to France on a trip for 4 months in 1948. Maxwell said it took him about 10 years to write this book, and he said it took him 10 years because it allowed him to spend 10 years in France. He'd visited France with his own wife after the war and had fallen in love with the country. They are travelling to a France which is still suffering the ravages of rationing and the post-war decline. And they're staying at the Château for most of the book. And really the story is about them, their frustration at being misunderstood and misinterpreting the French. There's a very amusing scene where they have breakfast, and the breakfast isn't the classic breakfast of croissant, pain au chocolat, and lovely crisp white bread. They have to eat black bread. The coffee isn't very good. The water is cold, and they're not given the bikes that they were promised. They imagine themselves cycling from chateau to chateau and visiting the region. None of these things appear, and their fellow guests in the chateau, which is run by a rather enigmatic character called Madame Vigneault, are distinctly unfriendly and unwelcoming. So really the theme of the book is this clash of cultures, clash of civilizations. They're constantly reminded by the French how easy the Americans had it during the Second World War, or how they don't have rationing, and they're very wealthy in comparison with the people they encounter. They gradually reach more of an accommodation, more of an understanding of their fellow guests and the culture of the country they're visiting. There's a character called Monsieur Carrère who, with his wife, when he's leaving, he's been very abrupt and rude to them. But he gives them a business card, and this is the equivalent from a French person of being given a hug. Nobody is on first name terms because we're in France, so this again jars with our American friends, the main characters, and they can't understand why they aren't being welcomed with open arms for providing money and business. But everything in French society is a little more subtle than they can realise. The second part has them travelling further afield, and eventually they're invited. They go to Paris, where they stay in a flat of one of their acquaintances, and they visit Paris. The end of the book is very modern. It's an epilogue for about 50 pages where Maxwell, the author, answers questions from his notional reader, and the reader asks quite specific questions about the various mysteries which have occurred. Why is Madame Vigneault so unfriendly? Is she rich or not? Where is Monsieur Vigneault? And he takes us through a series of answers which are fictive, and we can't really rely on those either. He prefers you to draw your own conclusions, make up your own mind about what he's presented to us. And this element of metafiction, if we can call it that, is, I think it works. A lot of people would not choose to read Maxwell, they would say that his books are too drawn out. This particular novel is about 400 pages, and it isn't driven by action or plot. Its interest derives from his analysis of cultural differences and character as he looks at the awkward silences that occur between people and the misunderstandings which lead to social embarrassment. But he does have, as I said, modernistic traits as well, allowing pieces of furniture, the chairs and the sofas in the chateau, to talk to each other about what's going on. But his focus in the book are the inadvertent social faux pas that different cultures make in different settings. If you like, you could summarize Maxwell by saying he's Henry James meeting Virginia Woolf. He interestingly doesn't translate the French. He uses quite a bit of French throughout the novel, but doesn't translate it, therefore putting the reader, if you don't speak French, in the rather uncomfortable position of being unable to understand what is being said. Well, William Maxwell himself was a fascinating character in New York. He was the literary editor of The New Yorker from 1936 to 1975. He wrote a selection of short stories and 6 novels in his long life, in his long career. And they are telling pieces of fiction which reward the reader. It is interesting that he puts his characters in a different setting, which allows Americans to be diffident, unconfident, rather than the brash caricature that we might have of them. Other books I would recommend by Maxwell, They Came Like Swallows, which relates to the Spanish influenza pandemic, as we've got used to that phrase, and is really his way of working through his own mother's death from that particular epidemic in 1918. Time Will Darken It and The Folded Leaf would be worthy of a read. But I've talked about The Château because I think it's, although it's one of his later novels, it's in fact his penultimate novel. It stands up to the others. While at The New Yorker, he was very well connected, and indeed was the first reader. J.D. Salinger asked him to read The Catcher in the Rye and to comment on it. So he was really influential. John Updike, J.D. Salinger, and most of the best-known novelists in America, in the USA, would have had contact with William Maxwell. So, if you haven't read it, I hope you enjoy it. And if you have read it, I hope whatever I've said shines new light on it. Thank you very much. Arrivederci.